Hello, everyone. I'm Ed Densel, and I host Unfound, and I run this YouTube channel. I realize you don't want to give a thumbs up to the following video until you watch it. You know what? That's totally understandable. I can appreciate that. But what you can do right now is subscribe to this channel. The button is right there. Thanks. Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Unfound Now. I am Unfound's host, Ed Densel. I hope everybody is doing fantastically. You should know, I think that this is episode number 25, which means, given that this is a monthly series, I've been doing this for 2 years now. It is hard to imagine. I don't know where the time has gone. But as the title suggests, I'll be talking about the disappearance of Dylan Rounds today. It seems to be a disappearance that has gotten quite a bit of national attention. He's 19 years old. He disappeared from Lucin, Utah on May 28th of 2022, so just about a month ago. If you're unfamiliar with Unfound Now, you may know about the podcast that comes out every Friday, but you're finding Unfound Now for the first time here on YouTube on our channel. Unfound Now got started for three principal reasons, and I'm going to go through those right now. Number one is publicity. Any disappearance, whether it's a month old or several years old, if it's unsolved, usually needs a lot of publicity. So that's number one. Number two is, over the past almost 6 years of doing Unfound, the regular podcast that comes out every Friday, I've covered 258 disappearances now, and I've generated some theories regarding disappearances, and I've had the pleasure of speaking at several schools, universities, to criminal justice students about these theories. So using these very new disappearances like Dylan's, I can show you some of those theories that maybe you can learn from them. And then when you go back and look at a lot of older disappearances, you can kind of apply what you've learned to those older disappearances if you take an interest in missing persons cases like I do. And number three, given that on the regular Unfound, we have to wait at least a year before we cover a disappearance on there, Unfound Now is all about instant analysis. So for number three, you get to see how I look at a disappearance right when I read it for the first time. What do I see? What do I notice that's missing from the article? Maybe reading between the lines. And that's something else that I've tried to teach all of you to do over the past 2 years. And of course, I'm going to be doing that with Dylan's as well. Now, also with every Unfound Now, I bring to this discussion, this talk, 3 points of learning. And with every Unfound Now, it can be a little different depending on the circumstances and depending on a whole host of different facts. It just depends. But for Dylan's, these will be the 3 points of learning that I will be discussing later in this video. Number one, clarity is king. Number two, ourselves alone. And number three, when it's foul play or not. So now we're going to go to Google Maps. I'm going to go through that for a few minutes. You'll just hear me instead of seeing me. I'll be going through the timeline a little bit, and then I will come back. You'll see me here again, and I will go through those learning points in a lot more detail, some in-depth analysis. And then at the end, I will just give you some of my observations, some things that I think we all should be paying attention to. Okay, let's look at the map for the disappearance of Dylan Rounds. And while we do this, I'm going to be going through some facts. I'm going to be going through the timeline and showing you this map. This is going to give me an opportunity to clarify some confusing information that kind of this is what happens when you have a disappearance that is this well known. Things get mixed up, and I think reporters start taking things for granted. And I'm going to try to smooth that all out during this portion of this video. And of course, later in this video, I'm going to talk about clarity in reporting on disappearances. But Dylan was 19 years old. He was a farmer all by himself, although it seems at one time he did have employees or farm hands working with him or for him, but it seems at the time, a month ago, that he was just working his land all by himself, and he lived in an RV on the land by himself and had just planted his crop, and he was very excited about that. First, most important part to understand is there are actually two locations in this disappearance that are important. This location over here, which is kind of, I guess, where you could say his shop was, his garage was, and then over here where the red mark is, and then over here in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, this is actually where the land was, where he was planting his crops. This is where he was actually doing the work, but way over here is the shop. And as you can see by driving, it's a 35-minute. They are not close together. 35 minutes, according to Google. Now, what kind of road this is, if it's only 6-something miles, but it takes 35 minutes, I guess that just tells you what kind of road it is. So this is important to remember. There are two different locations. And maybe almost importantly, there are two different trucks. And I will get into that. So there's the grain truck in there, and then there's the regular truck, and I will show you their locations just to make sure all of you understand this very clearly. Now, last seen by anybody who can be trusted, that's the way we like to put it at Unfound, is he was seen at a town that is off-screen. It's over here to the west, 30 miles away, not close. He was seen in that town at a bar, someplace like this. But this was on May 26th, which was let me do that real quick calculation on my head, which was a Thursday. So the preceding Thursday, he was west 30 miles. Did he often go to this bar? I don't know. How many people did he know over there? Who did he see? Kind of unclear. But that is this last public sighting, once again, for people who we trust. Then also on May 26th, he had a talk with his father, and his father was headed to Las Vegas, which, the road that goes there is off to the east of here, I-15. I'm very familiar with that highway, been on it many times back in the day. But they were talking, and they went out of range, which is not uncommon even to this day, going into areas where cell phones don't work in the western United States. Does not strike me as being odd. They were having a good conversation and just kind of cut out. But that was way on the 26th. On the May 28th, which would then be that Saturday, Dylan was talking to his grandmother, and he talked about how it was going to be raining, and he had this truck. Once again, there is his regular truck that he drives on the street, and then he has this grain truck, this crop truck that we might call it, where he puts can get a little messy on a farm, and all he does is drive that probably back and forth from where he is doing his farming to the garage, back and forth. This is probably the only road that this grain truck was on, whereas probably his other truck that we're going to be talking about would have been the one that he drove to this other town where he was at this bar. But he's talking to his grandmother, and the perception is that he was over here at his crop area, his field, and it was going to be raining, and he was worried about these seeds or whatever he had in the back of his grain truck getting wet because that would ruin them. I'm not a farmer. And so he wanted to get in his truck and drive it the whole way back to the shop and get it under cover so the rain wouldn't get on the seedings, which I guess can hurt their prospects for, growing into plants. So he told his grandmother that he was going to do that, and it seems that is what he did, because eventually that grain truck was found over at this location, covered up, and so we must take for granted that that's exactly what happened. It's just we get the idea that his grandmother thought that he was in a little bit of a rush. It was something important that something that he needed to do. And the ping was the phone ping was from this general area. Just looking at this area, I think you can tell there's probably only one satellite tower out there, satellite phone or cell phone tower out there. So it would not be unusual for, ping to be quite a ways away, but still be on the same tower because of there's just sparsely populated area. That's how it works. But after this call, as far as we, the public, knows, there are no calls or texts from his phone after this. That's not saying they don't exist. It just seems we, the public, don't know about that. Maybe they might even tell us there's nothing, and there very well could be something. That's very common in disappearances. But for public knowledge, we don't have any information about calls or texts after this conversation with his grandmother. So on the 29th, May 29th, which was a Sunday of 2022, nobody heard from him. Nobody seemingly saw him. On the 30th, people got worried. His parents go and show up at both of these locations, and we're going to go through those locations right now. Now, at the shop, which is this place over here where the red mark is, as I've already stated, the grain truck was there. It seems that Dylan did get done what he told his grandmother he was going to do, get that truck here, get it covered up or into a garage or something. So didn't care if the truck got wet, just cared what was in the bed got wet. This is where his boots were found. Not over here where he actually lived and slept, this camper over at the field. This is over here where the abandoned boots were found. And to hear his parents say it, these were the only the boots that he used while he was farming. And they were behind a mound of dirt. Doesn't sound necessarily like that they were hidden, but they just weren't obvious, is probably the way I would put it. If somebody wanted to hide boots, it'd be pretty easy to do that. So they weren't hidden, it's just they weren't in plain view. They were behind this mound of dirt, and when you hear about, the boots were in the opposite direction of the camper, what that means is that the boots were to the west of his shop. They were over here, so the camper's way over here. And so when somebody says that, or you've read that, what it means is the boots were to the east side of the shop, or to the west side of the shop, and not the east side of the shop. Does that mean anything? Could be. Of course, the boots just being abandoned by themselves seems to be strange. But it was not a situation, I guess you could say, where it looked like he started his walk back toward his camper and decided to get rid of his boots and walk in his bare feet. Obviously, that doesn't sound very probable anyway, but we'll get into that a little bit more in a bit. But the boots, when you hear about the boots being to the west of the shop, that means they're over here. They're not over here and to the west, they're over here and to the west. And they were about 300 yards from the shop, 900 feet, not quite a quarter mile, which is not close. 900 feet, pretty long ways. What that means, not sure. But there was eventually identified a speck of blood that was on them, although at this point, I'm not sure DNA could be quick enough to determine whether it was Dylan's blood or somebody else's. Now, here's the other part of it. So that is what they saw that day when they showed up at the shop where he usually parked his grain truck. So over at the camper where he actually slept, where his field was, this is where he was going to be growing everything. They show up and his truck is there. So the way I would probably say what he did was he'd get up in the morning, his regular truck's here, he'd drive it the whole way over here, leave his regular truck here, get his grain truck, and then drive it all the way back, work in the fields, use that grain truck for whatever he needed to do. And then at the end of the day, or maybe if he knew he could leave the truck outside if it wasn't going to rain or anything, he could leave it there, or if it was going to be bad weather, he could then take this grain truck the whole way back here, get his regular truck, and drive back. I think that's what he was doing. This is very common for farmers these days because Some of these farms, as we know, in the United States are huge, 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 huge. So it's not convenient to walk. Maybe somebody has an ATV or something, but it's not unusual for people to have trucks or something driving back and forth between distances, even though they're doing farming on their own property. What they noticed, though, was the truck that it was here was unusually clean, as if it had been spray washed. We're not saying it was spray washed, but it was that clean that it looked like it had been sprayed washed. I don't know if anybody actually saw him do that. It was just to the point it was so clean, we usually associate that with more than just with a sponge. And what they also noticed, this truck that he had, it was a four-wheel drive truck. However, the four-wheel drive system, I guess the transfer case or something, didn't work on it. And only the rear wheels, so it was just like a two-wheel drive truck, but it was stuck in four-wheel drive. You could drive it that way, but they thought that why would Dylan be doing that? Because he knew the four-wheel system didn't work. It was a regular cab truck. Those are so odd these days. It wasn't one of these big four-door where you can pack 6 people into it. It was just a regular cab, maybe fit 2, maybe 3 people in it. And the bench seat at this truck, which was over here, the bench seat was pushed or pulled up very far, to the point that his family thought there was no way that he could have fit to actually drive it comfortably between the steering wheel and the seat. It had rained, but there were no tracks, suspicious tracks or anything like that at all here. No signs that somebody else had pulled in there, no footprints. And over here at the shop, the same thing. That if there was somebody who showed up, it wasn't obvious or isn't obvious. Now, there are some strange stories regarding this. On May 25th, Dylan was telling someone in his family or a friend about how he was driving one way or the other between these 2 locations and encountered a guy who was barefoot. Just jumped out on the road, barefoot, wanted a ride, and Dylan did not give this guy a ride. Now, this is the type of story I think generally we would think, well, that just sounds crazy. Was Dylan losing his mind? Well, it turns out that this guy actually exists, and they did track him down. And I don't know if allegedly as an alibi, but I suppose maybe until this disappearance is solved, the guy will continue to be on everybody's list of suspects if we are to believe that foul play happened. But somewhere between here and there, Dylan was driving, and this guy just popped out. It sounds to me like this was something new, that Dylan had not seen this guy before, even though Dylan had been in this area for a long time. First time he ever encountered this guy. Who knows what this guy was doing, because there's nothing out there. It wasn't like Dylan driving in a city and like a homeless person who's barefoot jumps out. Quite a unique situation, but it seems like it happened. This is not a story that was made up. And like I said, they've tracked that guy down. I don't know if anybody knows his name as far as the public goes, but police have found him somehow. Another important fact is Dylan did have a couple employees, but no one was working with him at the time. And it does seem that he might have had a falling out with at least one of them. Maybe there's a story out there about an argument that he had with one of them. Could that mean something? Maybe. Hard to say. But at the time of his disappearance, him working his field over there, his land, just by himself. Now, what is missing? Of course, Dylan is missing, and his wallet is missing. He had a gun, a .40 caliber. I'm going to guess it was a semi-automatic that is missing, and his phone is missing. But the boots that he usually wore for his farming are not missing, like I stated. They were found over here, seemingly abandoned. I get the idea that they were just not like placed down on the ground neatly. It's like they were lying on their sides or something, as if just thrown there, something like that. Now, Is it conceivable, while you're looking at this map and before you see me again, is it conceivable that he's over here talking to his grandmother, it's going to rain, he drives the truck back, and maybe decides, I'm going to change shoes, and these boots are just messed up anyway. It doesn't matter if they get dirty. Takes them off, just throws them onto the ground, puts on different shoes, drives back to his place because that's where his regular truck was found. And then something happened here that was foul play over here in this bottom right-hand corner. Absolutely conceivable. There are no facts that I've heard or read that dispute that. So, once again, to go through that, he's with his, talking to his grandmother, says he needs to get back to the shop. He drives the grain truck back here. His regular truck's here. He decides, you know what, these boots are so messed up, I'm just going to throw them out here. I'll just get them tomorrow. And he puts on another pair of shoes, gets in his regular truck, of course, puts the grain truck away in the garage, drives the whole way back here, and then somebody's waiting for him or something happens in the middle of the night. Certainly conceivable. There are no facts to dispute that. So with that, you will see me again, and I will go through these points of learning for this video, and then I will offer my own observations, insights before we're all done. And I'm back. Before I get into those 3 learning points that I mentioned early in this video, I want to remind you, if you are finding Unfound for the first time here on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button right down there. Maybe it's over here. I always get confused. Is it the mirror image? I'm never quite sure, but I think it's over on this side. Maybe I'm wrong. One of those corners, just hit the subscribe button. We would appreciate it. Also, if you're feeling maybe a little frisky about knowing more about what we do here on this YouTube channel, hit the join button that is down there as well. For 10 cents a day, you get some things that other people don't get, or if they do get them, they have to wait a little while. For example, this Unfound Now episode, it will be coming out on June 28th of 2022 if you are a member of this channel. For everybody else, they're going to have to wait to about July 5th or July 6th. So you get it about a week early. There are also some other special things you get being a member on this channel. Just hit the join button, check those out, and it's only 10 cents a day. I think it's a pretty good deal. Also, share this channel, share this video for anyone you think might enjoy it, might find it informative. I would appreciate it. And if you feel like contributing to Unfound, patreon.com/Unfound Podcast, paypal.me/Unfound Podcast. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok now. That's new. And where else? The website, theunfoundpodcast.com. And if you would like to contact me directly, unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. All right, let's go to these 3 points of learning for the disappearance of Dylan Rounds. And maybe you've noticed me looking off to my left, your right. I don't do these off the top of my head. Yes, real surprise. But I'll be using some notes off to my left that are on my other laptop. And so if you see me glancing over there, that's what I'm doing. So number 1, clarity is king. Every family that has a disappearance happen wants a lot of coverage, and they're certainly entitled to it. Certainly. But as we all know, a lot of disappearances don't end up in the news at all. Not in local TV news, not on a website, not on Facebook, not on Twitter. Many don't get any attention at all for a lot of different reasons that I'm not going to go into here. But really I want to talk about the other side of that, those disappearances that get a lot of attention, like Dylan's. And sometimes get them right at the beginning, and then sometimes it seems like it takes a little while before, it becomes something. Maybe a disappearance that seems to be like that, at least for one that Unfound has covered, is Tom Brown's. Started out, got some coverage there in Canadian Texas, but then it just got a lot of media coverage going into 2018, which is when I covered his disappearance, and it has continued since. But it started out the media coverage very small and then got huge over time. Either way, whether it happens very quickly or very late, what I've found is a lot of times you go to different websites, different media sources, and you get conflicting information. And that is one of the issues I had trying to put this episode together. It was very hard to tell, well, where were the boots? Were they at the shop? Were they at the trailer? And it was not clear even from many of the articles, he has two trucks. His regular truck that he drove every day, and then this truck that he kept his seeds in and they actually used for the work he was doing on his farm. Read a lot of articles, that is not clear. In addition, I was on News Nation Now a few months ago, and even on their website, they cover a lot of disappearances now. They got some of the facts of Dylan's disappearance wrong. And in fact, on another site, there is an interview with Dylan's parents, and you'll find in the video the parents say one thing, and actually the print that goes along with the video is something different. This is common. And so for all of you, don't ever take just one source on a disappearance as being the truth and getting everything factually correct. We have to remember that these reporters are not like myself. If you listen to Unfound, you know that I don't mind an episode going 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours. We're going to do it until we get it right. We're going to cover everything as best as we can. Reporters at regular outlets, media outlets where they cover the weather, sports, and everything else, they have a certain amount of time to cover a disappearance. They have only a certain amount of space on a website or whatever to write, get everything correct. And they're usually required to do 6 or 7, 8 stories a day, and they are not disappearance experts. So they don't know how to look at something and be able to tell the key things that the public needs to know. So sometimes they leave things out, they get things wrong. I ask you to remember that as you look at disappearance news from now on. So that is kind of the downside, I guess you could almost call it. I mean, publicity is great, but if the publicity is so great that different sources in media get things wrong, it only leaves the public confused. And it very well may be that a disappearance, if it's going to be written about, just get it right once instead of getting it wrong 15 or 20 times. I see that this is very common. And it's just not common with recent disappearances that I covered like here on Unfound Now, but disappearances that are 20, 30 years old. It is not unusual for me to go back and on newspapers.com and find articles written about that disappearance that we know so many years later, it's just not true. They wrote something that is absolutely not true. I'm not saying the reporter was lying. They just got something wrong. It's very common. So clarity is king all the time. And I'm all about people, the general public, understanding disappearances. I think this is one of the reasons that disappearances go unsolved for so long, some of them, because the public is unclear, well, what exactly happened? Where did it happen? Of course, we don't know why it happened or how it happened, but we can get those other questions. We can answer them pretty well usually. And so, got to get that right. It has to be very clear where it was, where it happened, the description of the person or pictures, and it has to be consistent over many media sources. And so for the families out there who've had disappearances happen and they're still unsolved, you got to go back through all those articles that have been written about your loved one's disappearance and make sure they all connect. They're all in agreement. Otherwise, people can get confused very easily. Some examples of unfound disappearances where there was misinformation, disinformation, people getting things wrong. I'm just going to read a few of them right now. Flight 370. Yes, we did cover the disappearance of Flight 370 on Unfound way back in just about almost exactly 5 years ago with Jeff Wise. He was a great guest, Jeff, and he and I continue to communicate. Andrea Knabel. Was a disappearance we covered this year. She was a missing persons advocate. She went missing. Seemed to be a lot of conflicting stories out there about her disappearance. Elle Copper was a disappearance I covered. I think it was in 2018 or 2019. It's kind of from the area where I grew up in Leechburg, Pennsylvania. A lot of information, conflicting information there. And then the last one I'd like to point out is Laura Bible and Ashley Freeman's disappearance from 1999, where some of the articles even went as so far as to say they believe that Laura Bible and Ashley Freeman actually murdered Ashley's own parents and then set that trailer on fire. Don't have time to go into all the facts, but which is crazy. So clarity is king in covering disappearances if the public is really going to understand everything about that disappearance, at least that can be known at the time. All right, number 2, ourselves alone. I see this over and over again. This is very, very consistent. People who spend a lot of time on their own, if they go missing, they're some of the most difficult disappearances to solve if it goes for like a month or a lot longer. Why? Because if they, and I work from home, I am one of those people who spends a lot of time by himself. Given the work that I do, I can work from home here. But surely when people are alone, of course, we're not going to have any witnesses. There's oftentimes no one to even suspect. The timeline is hard to determine because then we have to start looking at phone information, social media information. There can be large gaps, even for people who use their computers a lot, their phones a lot. There can still be large gaps of hours, multiple hours, where it's hard to determine what that person was doing. And so you can see how this is relevant to Dylan's disappearance in that he was working out there, what I would call him a city dweller, but he's working out there in the middle of nowhere. And, of course, anything could happen. I'm going to talk about some of my observations here at the end of this video. But when you're alone like that, a lot of things that, everybody else takes for common, let's just say people who are married, people who live together, people who just have roommates, that is much different than, living by yourself or working, by yourself, being by yourself for hours at a time, if not days alone with no other humans around. But there's also the factor that's kind of by choice, but we also have to look at people who are alone by force, meaning maybe a woman who is in a relationship with a possessive man, and he won't let her go anywhere. And we've covered some disappearances like that. Those are also difficult to put the timeline together on, because a lot of times, of course, that possessive man is the person who caused the woman's disappearance, and he's going to do everything he can to mess up that timeline. Because he knows if the timeline is correct, it's going to make him look very, very guilty. So it's just not people like Dylan who live alone, work alone, but those people who are forced to be alone. Now, technically, they're not alone. Something is holding them there. But though that's also a huge factor in disappearances, it can be very, very hard to put it all together. Now, the paradox, of course, and I have this written in my notes, is the chances of going missing increases if you're in a relationship. I've talked about this over and over and over. Relationships are the number one cause of disappearances. But those types of people who are in relationships, it's more likely to be solved. Why? Because all you have to do is look at that boyfriend or that ex, that, someone like that. They're in a relationship. The relationships are the number one cause. Of course, you look at the person who's still around as being the best suspect. But so when you're single, the chances decrease that you're going to go missing. However, they're harder to solve. A little bit of a paradox. Once again, if you're in a relationship, you're more likely to go missing, but the disappearance is more likely to be solved. But if you're living alone, working alone, the chances of you going missing decrease, But if you do go missing, the disappearance is a lot harder to solve. It's very consistent, very, very consistent. Of course, when you're living alone, a lot of things that would not necessarily lead to disappearances can lead to disappearances. Head injuries, panic attacks, migraines, they all become much more dangerous when you are alone. And yes, I do believe some of those things that I just listed there can lead to disappearances. So some of the examples that we've covered on Unfound, the regular Friday podcast, that are like this. Mary Lands, she was being forced. She had been disconnected from her family. This boyfriend that she had would not let her talk to her family. She was living in isolation, just him and her. And I think a lot of people were convinced her boyfriend caused her disappearance. Jason Landry, driving alone back from college to home in Texas, seemingly got into a wreck. He's still missing, and it's been about 1.5 years since he went missing. He was alone, went missing. Steve Davis, this is a disappearance I covered in San Francisco within the last couple months, and this goes back to the 1980s. He was living alone in San Francisco, went missing. No neighbors to talk to, no girlfriend to talk to. He had a job, but he wasn't working from home. He was going someplace, but he was living by himself. And then he went missing. I think it was on Halloween back in the 1980s. Was it 1986? I'm testing my memory there. And then Audrey Herron, another situation kind of like Jason Landry's, going back to the early 2000s, where she was driving home from work. She's a nurse. She was headed home. She went missing. Both she and her car are still missing about 20 years later. So when you're alone, if something happens, it doesn't even have to be foul play. You can go missing very quickly, and it can be very hard to figure out what happened to you because you just don't know. Like I said, some of these, migraines, head injuries, if you're around somebody else, that person's going to say, oh, we got to get you to the hospital. If you're by yourself, you might not realize that you need to go, and then it's too late. And number 3, learning point for this coverage of Dylan Round's disappearance, when it's foul play or not. Now, I've spent some time looking at, for example, Web Sleuths, going through the forum there, the thread. I think they're on thread number 2 now. It's a lot of people talking about it. And it does seem to me that foul play seems to be the consensus opinion regarding Dylan's disappearance. And I'm here to say that I can fully say that at least the disappearances that we've covered on Unfound, I believe a large majority of them are murders. Whether they were planned or spur of the moment, maybe crimes of passion, I certainly believe that. But how can that be determined when there are no signs of violence? Because we rarely ever talk about DNA or anything like that on Unfound. Even though I believe a large majority of the disappearances are murders. And so what is that threshold? How can you kind of look at a disappearance, look at the public information, and be able to make a pretty good guess of, is this somebody who walked off? Is this a suicide? Is it an accident? Or is somebody else responsible for this disappearance? What pushes a disappearance from no foul play to foul play? Well, there's no easy answer. I have this in my notes over here. There's no easy answer even after all of these disappearances that I've covered. Either it's so obvious, and we covered the disappearance of Angela Green, who went missing in Kansas just a few years ago. Since the beginning, everybody has been suspicious of her husband because he told a variety of different stories. But you have to understand, it's not usually like that. What I will say is, always be careful about automatically attaching foul play to a disappearance. Always, always, always be careful to do that. And here's why. Here's what I've learned over almost 6 years. There are disappearances that I thought were foul play that did not end up being so. 2 right off the top of my head that have been solved since we covered them on Unfound. Esther Westenbarger. She vanished with her car. I thought that her brother, who's not a very good guy, did something to her. I was wrong. Turned out that Esther was probably drinking and driving, drove into a pond. She drowned in her car, and it took about 10 years to figure that out, and it was solved by accident. Also, Crystal Morrison from North Carolina, she went missing from her job. She called somebody to pick her up. When that person came to pick her up, she wasn't there. And her disappearance went unsolved for also almost about 10 years. And I thought foul play was there as well. Why? Because she was a former drug user. She still, I think, had some connections in that community. And I was thinking, well, after she called to get this ride, did she call somebody else because she needed a fix, even though it seemed that she was staying away from drugs at that point? But that's always going to be a thought. Instead, I was wrong. And it turned out that she had walked off after calling, and for whatever reason, and she died in the woods, and she was found by accident by a road crew, and her family is satisfied that there was no foul play. She probably died due to a combination of being sick, being over 100 degrees that day, being dehydrated, and being underweight due to her former drug use. It all combined for her to have like a stroke in the heat and died. Now, why she walked off, we may never know. So I've thought some were foul play and they weren't. Whereas I can tell you there's none of the opposite so far. Of the disappearances that have been solved by that we've covered on Unfound, that the ones that we think are foul play, have been foul play, aren't the opposite. Okay? It wasn't one where I thought there was no foul play and it ended up being foul play. It's always been the opposite, that thought there was foul play and it wasn't. Keep that in mind. I just cannot stress that enough. Even though I know thinking about foul play is, for a creative part of our minds, wants to go off all these different rabbit holes and everything else. I'm telling you, you got to stay away from that. Got to. So my best advice is when there are no signs of foul play and there are no contradicting or unbelievable stories, then it's not foul play. Now, we have covered some disappearances where it was obvious foul play. Jody Huisentruit, which is about where I think it was 27 years ago today, I think, that she went missing from Mason City, Iowa. She was obviously attacked in the parking lot. All of her stuff that she was carrying that morning going out to her car was strewn all over the parking lot. Obvious there was foul play. Somebody attacked her, took her away. We can presume that Jody ended up being murdered, but it's still unsolved all these years later. I covered the disappearance of Linda K. Carroll from up in the panhandle of Florida. This goes back to the 1980s. She was also surely a victim of foul play, probably by her estranged husband. How do we know? Because when they went to her house, her hair, it looked like somebody had drug her out of her house by her hair. Part of her scalp, her hair was wedged into the door jamb. And there was things strewn all over the inside of the house. Obvious. Then we also have the other situation, like I said, with Angela Green, where people who are close to the missing person are telling some stories and they're changing their stories, but they're not addicts or anything like that. They're perfectly sober people telling stories that just don't quite make sense, especially if that person is living with the person at the time. So either of those, of course, you're going to think foul play, and you should. Everything else that doesn't fall into those two categories, it's probably best to think that it was not foul play. So with Dylan's, we have nobody telling any, crazy contradicting stories, and there was no signs of violence. Please keep that in mind as you continue to, read about his disappearance and follow what's going on. Please keep that in mind. So my observations just in general. I've not talked to anybody in Dylan's family. I'm just going off what the public information has been. I've watched a couple interviews that his parents have done, and some other things, that I've read. There is nothing in this disappearance that strikes me as foul play. Very well could be, But like I said, no signs of violence. Nobody telling any unusually crazy stories. I did hear this story about, somebody calling something in for a bar owner or something like that. It's not clear to me that that was necessarily nefarious. It very well could be he heard somebody talking in his bar and thought it was real information. What you have to understand is that happens all the time in disappearances. People making things up. People who are not connected to the disappearance in any way, didn't know the missing person, not anywhere in the area, but they'll just start blabbing. Very, very common. So when you hear that, don't automatically think, oh, that person knows something. It's probably the opposite. Probably the person knows nothing. And I say no foul play despite the boots, despite the crazy barefoot guy, despite Dylan being all excited about his crop. I see nothing here that is foul play. Of course, on top of that, there's no vandalism. It wasn't like a competitor came in and trashed everything like another farmer. His truck wasn't vandalized. Nothing was stolen. His trailer was still there. Nobody broke into it. Nothing valuable stolen. And on top of everything else, farm boys don't make the easiest victims. Right? Especially if they're 19 years old. So usually, I'm just telling you what usually happens in disappearances like this. Usually, it's a disappearance that ends with a suicide or an accident. Now, rarely, given the general facts of Dylan's disappearance, rarely do these kinds of disappearances end with a decision of foul play. Now, the real tragedy is this could go unsolved for years. It could. And it could still be no foul play, and it could go unsolved for years. So I'm not making any guarantees about that. I never want to try to do that. Well, when's this going to be solved, Ed? I don't know. But there's nothing here at this point that tells me it's foul play. The issue also is that families so much want to believe that it was foul play because they want someone to blame. I've talked to my guests about this. They want to believe it was that, because the alternative is worse. That their family member, whether it's a son or daughter, sibling, parent, just walked off by choice. That to them is much worse than foul play, because once again, with foul play, then you can blame somebody. Whereas if the person just walked off, or it ends up being that the person did commit suicide, then there's no one to blame. And blame goes along with guilt with the work that I do. And a lot of my guests have that. I understand it. I'm not blaming them or saying it's necessarily wrong. It's a very natural human reaction. But my job as a person who analyzes disappearances is to be, like a scientist. Just go where the facts take you, no matter who's going to get hurt by them. That's just what I have to do. And I'm always honest with all of my guests. So, and also, and seemingly all that stuff that doesn't make sense is forgotten. And what I mean by that is, you have a lot of times where a disappearance happens, then you get all of these stories. Well, this certainly makes it look like foul play, and everybody's talking out there on Facebook and elsewhere, well, this is certainly strange, and that is certainly strange. Well, this certainly points toward foul play, and this points toward foul play. And then it turns out when the missing person is found, the person might not even be dead. And then suddenly all of those strange things that everybody thought was suspicious, suddenly they aren't suspicious anymore. So the question is, were they really suspicious or not? Like the boots certainly seems suspicious, but it very well could have been that Dylan said, you know what, these boots are trashed. I'm going to be getting a new pair. I'm just going to throw them out of the truck right here. I know I'm coming back here tomorrow. No big deal. They're not going to get damaged by the rain or anything. I'll put on another pair of shoes. No big deal. And he just kind of threw them out there, and then something happened after that. Foul play or not. Then that starts to make sense. It's not as suspicious anymore. So we just have to keep that in mind. There's nothing, like I said, that points to foul play in this. Being that his truck was washed out, and you hear the speck of blood, as I stated in the second point about ourselves alone, what I start thinking about is Dylan had some sort of head injury, didn't realize that he had it, and it just overwhelmed him. I call it the Natasha Richardson effect, which is a common factor in some disappearances where people are by themselves. And there is like a precedent for this. I wrote this in here. Where is it in my notes? I don't see it right now. But there was a murder that happened where a son killed his parents. The father had an axe to the head and still managed to get out of bed the next day, go down and get in the morning paper, was cooking himself breakfast, and collapsed on the floor dead, even though hours before he had been hit in the head with an axe. Head injuries, there's still so much we can learn about the human mind and how these things can happen. The son eventually was caught and charged and was prosecuted for the murder of his parents. So it's just something to keep in mind also regarding head injuries. And it just seems to me this, I think, is kind of the direction that Dylan's disappearance is going. Now, where is he? I don't know. But I just don't see foul play being a factor here. So that's it. That is my coverage, the Unfound Now coverage for the disappearance of Dylan Rounds. And you will see me again next month. Thanks for watching.